Welcome everyone to our virtual All Partners meeting. We're sorry we can't be together in person, but we're looking forward to talking through our AI and Media Integrity Program area over the course of the presentation. My name is Claire Leibowicz, and I lead our AI and Media Integrity work alongside my colleagues Emily Saltz and Jonathan Stray, both research fellows at PAI. I'll be presenting alongside Emily and speaking to Jonathan's work today. So in recent years, advances in AI have prompted some to warn of an era in which seeing is no longer believing. As AI has been able to create images, video, text, and audio, this question of what's real or not continues to arise. However, the same techniques that make it possible to manipulate a video of Donald Trump also allow for creative expression. Here are just a few examples of AI art in which artists use sophisticated AI techniques to express themselves in a really beautiful way. But it's not only the deep fakes like those shown on the first slide or this sophisticated AI-generated art that is necessary in order to manipulate images today. Even I can manipulate images with the click of a button. On the left, you're looking at my very first ever Instagram post, heavily filtered. And on the right is my embarrassing, ludicrous self in a canonical New York City coffee cup that I put together preparing for this presentation. And while I'd argue that this heavily filtered Instagram post is not going to prompt the demise of the public square, notions of how we manipulate content today, alongside how algorithms show us content and share content online, deeply affect how information spreads and flows today. But many of these techniques are not new. People have been manipulating imagery and narratives more generally for a very long time. Here's an image of Joseph Stalin from the 20th century walking alongside the Moscow Canal, in which from left to right, the man on his left has been removed. And Stalin utilized teams of human power to change images to sow discord and also inject a narrative into the public that was false. So it's important today to situate a lot of the technologies and tools for creating manipulated content in the real practices we've seen for a long time. And it's with this in mind, the potent force of content manipulations and also ways in which we share information today, that we at PAI have launched our AI and Media Integrity Program area around this fundamental question of how we ensure high quality public discourse in the AI age. And notably, there's this prerequisite question of what is high quality public discourse and who ultimately gets to decide what that definition is. And to us, it's vital to cultivate a multidisciplinary community and field of experts to ensure that AI is governed responsibly and with attention to the social dynamics of how information spreads, and ultimately to ensure a positive impact on the information ecosystem. So many of our partners focus on some piece of the pie in AI and media integrity, but to us, cultivating a field of multidisciplinary actors is really vital to addressing the challenges this issue area presents. So we've cultivated from our vantage point technologists, but not only AI researchers or product managers or engineers, but also policymakers at technology platforms and others working on content decisions, academics, those in civil society, human rights advocates, and even those within the media entities themselves making a lot of decisions about information to build this field that's attentive to the socio-technical dynamics of the information era we live in today. And from our vantage point, PAI can serve as a forum for collaboration, best practice generation, and attend to areas that require coherence and a collective sense of urgency in the AI and media integrity field that is so cross-cutting. So over the course of today's presentation, I'll give a bit more background into how PAI thinks about this work and what inspired it. That will then inform our 3 sub-areas of work to date: synthetic and manipulated media, audience explanations, and content targeting and ranking. And then at the end, I'll speak to future work, what we can expect, and how you'll be able to participate in our work moving forward. So again, those 3 sub-areas we focus on within AI and media integrity are synthetic and manipulated content, which I teed up in my introduction, audience explanations, so how do we have deepened understanding of the actual end users and audiences who make sense of content online, which we think is so integral to not only technical decisions about AI in this field, but all of our decision making here. And then more recently, content targeting and ranking. So these questions around how we personalize and choose to show content online today. And there are 3 main vessels, almost modular multi-stakeholder contexts that allow us to do our work. The smallest is our AI and Media Integrity Steering Committee, a cohort of 9 actors, a third from civil society, a third from media, and a third from industry, that meets bi-weekly in a more formal venue for consistent input on our work. We then cultivate bespoke workshop cohorts around different topics within AI and media integrity, both from our partner community and from beyond. And the largest, which is open to all partners, which meets very infrequently, but is a forum for input on our work that is very diverse, is the Social and Societal Influences of AI Expert Group. Here's a timeline of our work to date, from inception at the end of 2018 to the current moment. And I'm going to zoom in on some of our early work that has informed some of the strategy for how we pursue questions of AI and media integrity. At PAI's founding, our board put together 6 thematic pillars that encapsulate broad issue areas within the AI space. One of which was the social and societal influences of AI, which encompassed vast challenge areas like AI's impact on privacy, human rights, democracy, and other challenging and multifaceted societal features. And about 2 years ago, we launched this thematic pillar more specifically around questions of AI and media integrity that we felt were really ripe for the type of multi-stakeholder input that PAI can bring to bear on work. And this question in particular at the time scoped more narrowly to the emergent threat of AI-generated mis- and disinformation. In order to respond to the need for more cross-pollination between media entities and inspire our future work, we hosted a BBC and Witness media preparedness workshop in collaboration with those entities in May of 2019. And actually, just to clarify, so we felt there was a need for more intentional connections between media entities and technology platforms and the scope of actors at tech platforms working on these issues, alongside civil society and academia. And at that workshop, we focused on detection, how we can actually build systems to find and respond to problematic content online, provenance interventions, which might help bake in notions of authenticity in content itself in the first place, explanations, this very human notion of how we communicate mis- and disinformation interventions effectively to the public, and lastly, this more existential need for broadened coordination between actors working in and around this field. And at that workshop, despite being focused on AI-generated mis- and disinformation, the week before, this now viral, ubiquitous video of Nancy Pelosi that, if you remember, seeing it was merely slowed down, no AI tools were used, was spreading. And it showed her kind of seeming drunk or unfit for office. And it provided this really elegant counterpoint to a workshop supposedly focused on AI-generated mis- and disinformation, to remind us of the reality that there are many unsophisticated non-AI forms of content online that could be just as misleading as an AI-generated piece of content. And it was this reminder and this instance in which we were able to situate the AI threats in that of the broader information landscape that we've kind of contributed to this ethos in which we do our work, where AI should be thought about as part of a broader information landscape. It is one part of the problem. It is not the sole problem in terms of tools and technologies that allow people to manipulate content. And it also could be part of the solution, but is by no means going to solve all of our information integrity challenges. And to that end, we really as PAI need to consider adjacent issues to AI and information integrity, to think about using AI successfully, and to engage stakeholders who might not have perfect expertise in AI, but understand the dynamics of information and misinformation and other forms of content that spread online today. And it is this kind of philosophy that has informed the projects that we've pursued since that early work, which I'll speak to in more detail within their subsections. As a reminder, those subsections in which we break down our AI and media integrity work are synthetic and manipulated content, audience explanations, and content targeting and ranking. So I'll dive into synthetic and manipulated content first. As you may have gleaned from my introduction, AI advances have extended the realm of possibility for generated text, audio, video, and imagery's impact on civil society and discourse. Just imagine if Joseph Stalin didn't need to employ a team of human actors to manipulate imagery, but had AI techniques for synthesizing images in the first place. But also recent AI advances allow us to have potentially novel solutions for combating problematic content. Not only AI generated content, but even the less sophisticated kinds like the Nancy Pelosi video. And we might be able to help respond, detect, and note content that misinforms, manipulates, harasses, or wrongfully persuades. And it's with this in mind that we want to think about a lot of the questions associated with these advances. The projects that we've worked on respond to these themes that I just posed and these motivations. The first to mention is our AI and Media Integrity Steering Committee, which is not a project per se, but it is a group that meets to work on projects both within the partnership and outside, so from partners, and that meets bi-weekly to think about and advise on solutions that strengthen information integrity solutions. This group has a third membership from civil society, a third from industry, and a third from media. And the group's first project, when launched about a year ago at the All Partners meeting a year ago, was the Deepfake Detection Challenge, which is a machine learning challenge to incentivize development of tech solutions that detect manipulated media. And notably, Facebook, which is the organization that launched the challenge alongside Amazon and Microsoft, in bringing this challenge to the multi-stakeholder context, to the steering committee, where we have human rights advocates and misinformation experts and journalists. In doing so, that situates a ostensibly technical question about how to classify videos in the realities of how malicious, manipulated media spreads today. And to that end, through this exercise in multi-stakeholder governance, we actually came away with an existential question that kept emerging on whether or not detection, merely noting if a video, an artifact, has been manipulated, actually can help mitigate and minimize the impact of misleading information. And a few themes emerged there. One, this notion of access and whether or not it should just be the large technology platforms with concentrated technical expertise that can detect content, because there are many other actors who are involved in the media verification landscape. Two, and this intertwines with access, the adversarial dynamics of this space, the idea that any mitigation technique might also be used by adversaries who want to evade detection or mislead in the first place. Another question around whether or not detection can work on real-world examples. If we simulate videos, will those actually, and train models based on that, will we actually be able to apply that technique in the wild to respond to the most threatening, malicious, manipulated media? And lastly, how do we explain the results of uncertain detection algorithms to decision makers and ultimately content adjudications made based on those outputs to the public, making sense of content online? And this, alongside many, many descriptions of effective multi-stakeholder governance of a traditional machine learning challenge, is in a report that we published in March 2020 on the challenge, which I encourage you to read for more information. Now that group came away from the challenge on detection, realizing that technical detection is part of addressing information integrity challenges, but is by no means a panacea for all the challenges posed by information manipulation today. And while we should continue to invest in model creation, we should also think about research on making those results from the models understandable and useful, as well as this idea of how to broaden access to tools and technologies for information manipulation mitigations for others in the community. So journalists, civil society, fact checkers, and others. And this idea, alongside a recognition that many platforms are starting to think about how to increase access to these types of tools and even commercial technologies, inspired a workshop where we focused on this question of synthetic media detection tools. Now, we are in the COVID era, so this took place over the course of a 5-part online workshop in spring of this past year, where the group believed that these tools and technologies, one, are they useful, but two, if they are going to be useful, that they need to be coordinated, respond to the adversarial dynamics posed by this issue area, attend to the needs of users around the world and their capacity constraints, and really be inspired by this cross-sector input into their creation. And the workshop prompted recommendations for tool builders that have also inspired resource allocation and suggestions for future work. So what should tool builders consider, and what should we as a field think about when thinking more generally about detection tools and malicious media mitigation techniques? One, the accuracy of the models. We've realized that these should not be used independently to form conclusions about real use cases. They are not perfectly accurate or generalizable to real use cases, but they might be an effective triage mechanism for large platforms. Two, these adversarial dynamics that we've discussed show that it's not a question of if, but it's when these tools will be used by adversaries if they are out in the open. And that's really important to think about. But that also doesn't mean that we should keep them totally closed to the chest. We kind of need to create a rigorous infrastructure and protocol for assessing who should get access to these techniques and why. An idea that emerged often also was that it's not just AI-generated content that I started this talk with that poses a challenge to discourse, but cheap fakes like the Nancy Pelosi video, and even miscaptioned videos and the like. And to that end, any robust intervention, technical or not, needs to attend to the spectrum of media and content that can be misleading today. And lastly, how do you explain the tool's output to users and make it understandable? So even though we focused quite a bit this year on malicious manipulated content, it's important to remember that example at the top of AI art, and that not all AI generated content is inherently misleading or malicious. And one example of that are artistic use cases. And we collaborated with Leah Coleman, a wonderful AI artist, on this whimsical AI art field guide, in which we think of artists almost as de facto AI researchers in this space when creating their work. And we give them some tools, questions, and suggestions for how to make art responsibly and with care. And here's just one image excerpt from that field guide, in which it shows the milestones in which we take these artists on a journey up the mountain of responsible AI checkpoints. So in the future, we want to build upon this work to move beyond detection and also continue to think about coordination in the synthetic and manipulated content prong of AI and media integrity. First, we're going to be creating an adversary map to really ground the notion of who these abstract adversaries are in the input of a global suite of actors thinking about the challenges posed by manipulated content. This will then inform an access protocol project, which will be specifically applied to how you think about who should get access to synthetic media detection tools, but will also be useful as a framework for how to assess the trade-offs between adversarial use cases and a need for increased access in the community to tools and technologies. We then want to respond to that existential question about detection by thinking about provenance interventions that allow us to assert content authenticity. And lastly, deepened opportunities for coordination between the field and field building opportunities in order to make sure we cultivate the right expertise within this broad issue area. So with that, throughout the DFDC and ultimately in all of our work on technical aspects of detection and provenance and beyond, fundamentally, we always return to this idea that at the end of the day, it will be people making sense of that algorithmic output and ultimately the content that gets decided upon and shown to users. So I'll pass it along to Emily to talk through our work on audience explanations.
Thank you, Claire. So to start, here are some of the central questions that motivate this area. First, as Claire just discussed, synthetic media detection tools are improving, but even if they were perfect, that's still only part of the question. How would those detection tools be used for different audience use cases to actually make sense of those results? Next, how do people even understand and use manipulated media in the first place across that broad landscape from deepfakes to deepfakes? And finally, how can platforms actually design user interfaces, such as labels for misinformation, responsibly in ways that address those underlying user needs and effects on the broader public? The way we think about it, detection and media forensics tools are really only as good as people's ability to actually use them and make decisions based on them. So what this diagram shows is the way algorithmic outputs of the kind Claire spoke about, as well as investigative work by journalists, fact-checkers, and the public, work together to feed into some kind of user interface. For example, as shown here, Facebook's false information label informed by fact-checker ratings. But what are the goals of interfaces like these, and how do different people actually understand and react to them? So a few of the projects that we've started to explore these questions include a literature review of design principles that platforms can use to inform their labeling practices, a report on the automated categorization of manipulated media and some issues we see there. We've started some user research and have formulated a lot of ideas for future work in this area. To give you a little background on some of the earliest work PAI did in this area, it actually partially emerged from this typology that was developed as part of the media preparedness workshop and a subsection on how to communicate manipulations to the public. And what resulted was this attempt to kind of categorize what are the range of manipulations, not just including deepfakes, but the sort of lower tech manipulations that are out there, and how might you describe those tactics to audiences. So that was one way we started, but we knew that wasn't enough without actually understanding how people reacted and understood these kinds of categories. That takes us to March 2020, where Partnership on AI and First Draft launched a fellowship to research these questions around how audiences respond to labels for manipulated media, which is when I actually stepped into this role as the research fellow. And the urgency of these questions, meanwhile, has obviously only increased as platforms from Reddit to Facebook to Twitter each use their own processes and designs to label manipulated media and misinformation. The result is still a sort of confused landscape of labels leading to pretty unknown societal effects. What even makes an effective intervention and who gets to decide that? So to begin to kind of wrap our heads around this area, we worked with some of our colleagues at First Draft, and over the course of many conversations with our partners and reading hundreds of studies, we put together this compilation of principles or best practices for labeling manipulated media. And here's just a snapshot of some of those principles. And two things that I want to point out. The first principle there, don't attract unnecessary attention to the mis and disinformation. There's a point at which labeling, we recognize, might not even be the best intervention. It might, in some cases, be better not to expose someone to something at all. So we don't want to take that for granted, that labeling even is always the best intervention. And then we offer a bunch of tactics from the literature that we think can help the effectiveness of people responding to and making use of those labels. But finally, Principle 12, adapt and measure labels according to the use case, acknowledges that these principles are really only a starting point and only as valuable as the goals that you're measuring them against, which we in the piece talk about the need for more transparent metrics around these things. Meanwhile, we also realized it wasn't enough to think about these kinds of principles in the abstract, but you needed to understand how they were applied in action based on existing rating systems for media, such as Facebook's rating system, or the development of the media review rating system, as shown here from the Duke Reporters Lab, which is a project with funding from Google and Facebook, specifically around these questions of fact-checker ratings for manipulated media. So we wanted to understand how can we think about how these labels might actually eventually be used in interventions that audiences see. And that led to the second work, which is a blog around considerations for the automated categorization of manipulated media, which summarizes some of the issues that we foresee about how these rating systems might be used in concert with automated application of these labels at scale. And that was co-authored with colleagues at Witness and First Draft, and really helped to ground these issues in past examples and what we foresee as future issues. And all of this taken together, we also knew it was incomplete without actually talking to people firsthand to see those attitudes and behaviors in real time to the kinds of labels we're talking about. So over the last few months, we started with a series of one-on-one in-depth interviews with a handful of people around the country who we believe were exposed to COVID-based mis and disinformation in order to understand those attitudes to existing labels and terminology, followed by a diary study with 20 users, which is basically a way to get people to submit and describe examples that they're encountering in real time of these critical moments of trust and distrust. And then finally, from the themes of those more in-depth, small-scale interviews, we want to understand how those themes generalize on broader populations in order to inform and kind of zone in again on further research. And to give you just a glimpse into some of the things we've started to hear, there's really a deep division on how people view these labels, but tend to fall along two kind of poles. So here's one example from a woman in California, a Democrat, who in reacting to the idea of labeling says, lots of people aren't going to take the time to look for the real context, so take a stand and say it's false. So this is really the kind of point of view that there is kind of an underlying true or false that platforms are able to identify, and that if anything, they're just not doing enough and need to take more of a stand in labeling that content. In contrast, here's another perspective from a woman in South Carolina who, in reacting to labeling on platforms, says, it feels like platforms are trying to dictate what information gets through to you. It makes social media seem biased. I don't need them to spoon feed me information. So this exemplifies the kind of attitude that labeling in principle is just kind of paternalistic and offensive, and inevitably from a specific viewpoint. So to give you an idea of some of the future work to dig more into these questions, another project we've realized is really crucial is creating an ecologically valid testing environment to better understand how labels play out in realistic contexts, so that it doesn't just have to be a platform studying these questions, but any independent researcher. Next, from our initial rounds of research, we'd like to continue kind of targeting who we've then identified as the most affected or marginalized groups who are affected by manipulated media issues. And then finally, leverage our partnership to conduct a listening tour of civil society and industry in order to better understand what are some of the broader global risks of these issues and ways that we can better prioritize what we're focusing on. And now to our last sub-area. So even independently of labeling a piece of content, what kind of content, what determines what content people are seeing in the first place is a really important question. So that takes us to this area of content targeting and ranking, and I'll pass it back.
Thanks, Emily. So yeah, even if we had perfect labels on a singular piece of content, it's important to think about the broader way in which we choose to deliver that content to people. And we're thus beginning work on this content targeting and ranking. And the idea is that the online content we interact with and how it gets shown to us, which is largely dictated today by algorithmic systems optimizing for some thing, maybe engagement or not, contributes to a variety of outcomes ranging from informativeness, agency, well-being, addiction, and even voter turnout. And my colleague Jonathan Stray, a research fellow at PAI, has thus begun to work on these themes in order to evaluate how we can create a participatory design process and create principles around how we choose to prioritize certain content or values, and then how we operationalize those values in practice. So here's one example from news targeting and ranking. And there's two fundamental questions. One, which is what makes something worthy of being newsworthy and prioritized in the first place from a values vantage point? And then how do we take that value and make sure it is mapped into the ways in which recommender systems work online? And to embark on this work, Jonathan just this past month led a workshop of around 35 participants to really think about the state of the art in designing content ranking and recommendation systems. And at that workshop, we thought about how do we align values with AI systems and operationalize those values. And as we build upon this work, we're hoping to align on metrics, which are key ways for outside stakeholders to communicate and collaborate on what recommender systems should recommend. And we're hoping in the future, this is again very early stages, to draw upon this participatory governance and value assertion with user feedback through surveys and human input into the recommendation systems, and then a transparent assertion of how those led to different outcomes. So in order to make sense of where we're headed with all of this previous work and some of the nuggets of kind of glimmers of foreshadowing in the work that we're going to do, I'm going to move into all of our future work and how you might be able to get involved. So again, there are three venues in which we do work, from smallest to largest, from most selective and curated to largest. The AI and Media Integrity Steering Committee now features 9 organizations, and it's at the discretion of PAI staff to add new organizations to that body. It's capped at around 15 members, so we don't envision it getting quite big. And we bring participants on to keep the relative balance of civil society, media, and industry, and also depending upon the projects and expertise required for those particular projects. In workshop cohort situations, they're typically cultivated by PAI staff and through partners. We draw upon both partners and non-partners depending on the issue area. And we're hoping to be more informative through our newsletter about upcoming workshops, so we allow certain seats to the general partnership. And then lastly, an opportunity for everyone. The Social and Societal Influences of AI Expert Group is a loose collective of partners that we call upon at different phases of multi-stakeholder work. We try and send newsletters to keep updated on AI and media integrity specific events, and we're hoping to draw upon this group more into 2021. So if you're interested, that's a great way to start getting involved in this program area. And now a deeper dive into future work in each sub-area. Within synthetic and manipulated content, this consistent theme of adversaries and how they impede open access to mitigation tactics for manipulated content continued to emerge. And we felt that there was a need for a multi-stakeholder global assessment of who those adversaries are. So we're not just talking in the abstract, but we're actually grounding it not only in the viewpoint of one company, but that of the collective field and how we all assess threats in that space. So in the next few months, we'll be developing this map of adversaries for manipulated content threats that will hopefully be a great grounding point for questions of access protocol moving forward. And it's there that we'll be able to tease out who should and should not get access to manipulated content mitigation tools based on that taxonomy, which will hopefully be a framework that you can apply to other instances where this trade-off between adversarial uses susceptibility and access to others in the field and community is a question. Also, continuing to expand beyond detection as an intervention for combating the threat of malicious content, it's important to plug into much of the work happening in provenance. Many of our partners from media and others are involved in authenticity infrastructure creation and also notions of how we bake in the origin of content into the web. And we want to be involved in that as it continues to be a notable, noble solution for some of the issues we see in terms of information credibility online. And lastly, continually across all of this work, it's important to have venues and fora facilitated where all of these communities can continue to meet, especially in the COVID era where we're not running into each other at conferences, and PAI can serve that purpose into the future. And we encourage all of you who are interested to get involved. In audience explanations, Emily's work on labeling will take us through the end of the year, but moving forward, we want to make sure that more people can do this really important audience research. And we've noticed this existential tension between platforms wanting more research from the academic community and from others. But at the end of the day, the academics are not able to test their work in native test environments, which makes their results less useful for making intervention decisions on the part of the platforms. So we want to lower the barrier to entry for this research, for this translation and transparency in these communities so that our interventions on platforms and beyond can be informed by evidence-based user and audience research grounded in the people who are being interacted with. Further, we want to continue that user research and to co-design interventions with affected and marginalized communities who are most susceptible to the negative impacts of mis and disinformation. So we'll continue that work at PAI. And as Emily described, we want to leverage our unique vantage point of being able to understand industry's challenges and opportunities within the intervention and labeling space, alongside those of civil society, to figure out the needs and risks and challenges and opportunities of labeling globally. And lastly, led by Jonathan, our earliest stage work on content targeting and ranking, we have a recommender system alignment discussion group where we have an interdisciplinary cohort that collaborates and shares on responsibly designing recommendation systems and recommenders. And this group is hopefully going to bring its expertise to bear on a collaborative survey and metric design protocol to test out how we could try and optimize for certain values in the multi-stakeholder context embedded in the technology. So we have our hands full. To visualize the upcoming several months, the steering committee will continue to meet bi-weekly and weigh in on work. We'll continue to cultivate workshop cohorts. We've even seen workshops that were supposed to only take place for 5 weeks continuing to meet almost monthly as venues to share work and field build, and the expert group will continue to call upon throughout this whole time. Our Taxonomy of Adversaries project will take us through the end of the year, and then it will evolve into this Protocols and Access project into 2021, alongside work in the provenance space. Our labels research and audience explanations takes us through the end of the year, and then into 2021, we will be focusing on the ecologically valid testing and furthered user research. And lastly, Jonathan will lead content ranking projects and discussions into 2021, and hopefully a participatory co-design of a recommender with a partner. So here's just a visual depiction of this moment onward, which will hopefully keep you apprised of through newsletters and other publications on our Medium post and beyond. So for better or worse, many of the challenges we work on and opportunities aren't going away anytime soon. Information continues to spread, and it's spreading in more complicated ways to this moment. And we really encourage everyone at PAI and beyond, and an increasingly global cohort of actors who all have something to bring to the table as it relates to this issue of high quality public discourse, to join us in working on this project into 2021 and well beyond. So with that, we'd love to take Q&A, but I'm talking into a screen. So if you feel inclined, please send questions or thoughts to aimedia@partnershiponai.org, and we'll do our best to get back to you, and we'll keep you up to date on all of our happenings. So thanks so much, especially to the AI and Media Integrity Steering Committee and these specific members, but also all partners who have contributed more than you can imagine, whether in the form of a Zoom conversation or active participation in our workshops, to informing our work in this space, and are major contributors to this field, no matter how much they participate at PAI to date. And lastly, a big thank you to all of the PAI staff, Emily for presenting with me, and Jonathan, of course, but we are a small but mighty team that all contributes to making our work happen every day. So thanks so much, and hopefully next year, we will see you in person.